All right, so fifth period, you already saw this slide. Sixth period, we were getting to it when class ends, so I'll go ahead and do it for sixth. Fifth, skip it, obviously. All right, so during the 1920s, with consumerism on the rise all across the country, we saw that with the ads, with the media, with companies mass producing, selling us national products and whatnot. We're also going to see a flourishing of culture in this time period, with some of it supporting the change, a lot of it opposing the changes that's going on in America, and we're going to see that a lot with the lost generation. They're going to be a group of writers that in the 1920s were generally disenchanted. They were writers who, back in the progressive era, would have been idealists, who would have been very optimistic about the direction of America, but now we're starting to see how they don't like the direction of the country, especially how people have sacrificed any political ideology for consumerism. And so we're going to see that with several authors. We're just going to focus on three here. You've got F. Scott Fitzgerald, who writes several books. His most famous is The Great Gatsby, which ultimately is about Nick, who, if you've already read it, you have seen where Nick doesn't like what's going on with, or he likes what's going on with society, initially worshiping Great Gatsby, and then he starts to realize Gatsby has problems, and then Gatsby longs for Daisy, and Daisy's with Tom, and everybody's life falls apart. And by the end of it, Nick just wants to leave, and that's going to be indicative of the mindset of the lost generation, who totally oppose what's going on in America and are starting to say, why have we gotten into money and consumerism and all this stuff when we should be focusing on other things? Ernest Hemingway does the same stuff. He writes a lot of books where it looks like there's idealism, like in 1929's The Sun Also Rises, where an American goes over to fight in Italy, to fight in this idealistic war, World War I, obviously, but it isn't going well. He starts to become disenchanted with that, and he starts to wonder, like, if there's anything worth fighting for. He falls in love with a girl. They end up getting married. She's pregnant. He decides to leave. They flee to Switzerland, and then she dies giving birth to the child, who also dies, and the book ends with you feeling empty, which is kind of what they're saying about America. And another of his books, Old Man of the Sea, same thing happens. The guy's out in the ocean, and he dreams of catching a giant marlin. By the end of the book, he's caught it, but it's just a skeleton of what it was after sharks eat it. He sails back into shore. Everybody's worshiping him for how big a marlin he caught, but he just looks at them, saying that they don't see that it's just this empty shell, so he's disenchanted. And then the last scene of the book, he dreams of white lions on a West African shore, where even the old man didn't learn from his own failed attempt that ultimately there's nothing worth fighting for, but he keeps fighting. So these people are obviously very cynical, very jaded, very disenchanted, and that becomes the lost generation mindset. Sinclair Lewis writes a lot of books, Main Street, Elmer Gantry, stuff like that. His most famous book, at least to me, is Babbitt. Babbitt is about a real estate developer. He's the guy in the middle of the picture that you can see. His wife is the lady in green. They have the model American lifestyle where they have money, they have the nice house, they have the positions of prestige, nice clothes, etc., etc. He falls in love with the lady in red that you can see in the picture, young, college student, idealistic, represents, like progressive ideology in America. He wants to leave his wife to be with the lady in red, but by the end of the book, he decides he can't because his wife tells him she has cancer and is dying, so he decides to stay with her while she dies. The lady in red leaves, and he basically ends the book depressed and with life seeming meaningless, and that becomes the slant of the lost generation, these writers who eventually abandon America and move to France. Okay, another thing we're going to see in culture is how migration is going to cause a lot of impacts on culture. We're going to see this with just different people moving around. The car is obviously a part of that. People looking for jobs, looking for opportunities, looking for new ways of life. And so we're going to see a lot of this. One example we're going to see is how Southwestern culture, kind of the borderlands between the United States and Mexico, we start to see that becoming more a part of our national story. With art, especially George O'Keeffe, an artist from the Midwest who moves out to the Southwest and starts painting, gets in a lot of trouble for a lot of her precisionist paintings, mostly because there's a lot of sexual overtones to them. But ultimately, you do see embedded in these paintings a lot of the Southwestern kind of environment or mindset or just landscape, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing that in her paintings. We're also seeing it in Frida Kahlo, who comes to country from Mexico, famous artist, goes through a lot of tragedy, suffering, et cetera, and paints a lot of self-portraits that depict all the pain she's going through. But within it, as you can see in this painting, you just start to see elements, some of the dry landscapes. You see the skull that's indicative of parts of Mexico culture, like Day of the Dead and whatnot. So you just see parts of this Southwestern kind of culture becoming more a part of our national story. And then you get to the most famous example of cultural flourishing in this time period driven by migration. And that's something we're going to deal with on the next slide, and that is going to be the Great Migration and how African American culture in America is going to go through a lot of changes during the 1920s. So what's going on with the black community in the 1920s? A lot of changes, obviously. I said that on the left side. The first thing we're going to see is just the changes brought about by the Great Migration. Over 450,000 African Americans leave the rural Southeast for the urban Midwest and Northeast. And there's going to be a lot of positive changes that occur here. Some things that don't, unfortunately, change, but we're still going to see how this becomes a period of development for the black community. One of the most famous examples of that is the Harlem Renaissance, which a lot of times you would see as like the cultural flourishing of the black community in America in this time period, where basically African American community has always had a distinct culture, but in the rural Southeast, just a lot of people weren't able to access it, or we just didn't have the media resources to make this widely available to people all across the country. But we are going to start to see this as it's coming out of places like Harlem and other cities up north. Okay, and so with that, we see just several different indicators of this. The most famous is Langston Hughes. He is a poet, writes a lot of poems in this time period, just very optimistic in tone, but very realistic about just the challenges facing the black community with segregation, discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what's going to happen is he's going to write a lot of these poems. Some of his most famous, Let America Be America Again, I Too Am America, Po' Boy Blues, and many, many others. But you keep seeing this just different perspective where, unlike the Lost Generation, completely cynical and hopeless, he had hope embedded in his poems, where a lot of times it looked like he did believe at some point equality would occur, or at least steps towards it. And so he was just waiting for it and encouraging it with his writing. So a lot of examples, but we'll move on. All right, Zora Neale Hurston, perhaps the most famous novelist of this era from the Harlem Renaissance. She writes several books, the most famous of which is 1937's The Sun Also, or not The Sun Also Rises, that's Hemingway. Their Eyes Were Watching God. And it's basically a book about a woman who has struggles with relationships, ends up in several relationships where many of them, they might start well, but then they go bad, eventually develops a pretty good relationship with a man who's a musician, but if I'm remembering correctly, it's been about 20 years since I've read it. But then he gets attacked by a dog, I believe it was, gets rabies, dies. So once again, much like, and there's a lot more to it than that, but we're going quickly through this, a lot like the Lost Generation, you know, where there are signs of hope, there's just nothing to put hope in. So you get a lot of that cynicism and that messaging coming out of this time period where a lot of people in both the Lost Generation and Harlem Renaissance are just a little skeptical that America is ever going to change and just kind of disenchanted with the changes that had been going on with America. Maybe the widest impact we're going to see on the United States is going to be jazz music, which becomes the national form of music. Artists like Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and many, many other famous musicians are going to help make this a music that becomes synonymous with American culture in the 1920s and 30s. And this is obviously a byproduct of the black community, as this music like this had been getting played for decades prior to the 20s, but now it's getting exposure to a national audience. And so the Harlem Renaissance obviously going to be this period where black culture is celebrated in America in a wide scale for the first time basically ever in our country's history. Okay, another thing we're going to see that's going to dramatically impact the black community in America is going to be World War I. As there were several thousand soldiers from the black community that participate in it. And when they go over to France, they were segregated into units that were they were not treated as well. They didn't get as many honorable positions like combat duty or promotions to officers. So there's a lot of treatment in the war that obviously leaves a lot to be desired from an equality perspective. But it's still a war where a lot of the black soldiers go over there and they're treated as heroes by the French population and other people that see all the American soldiers as heroes. And this helped open up a lot of soldiers' eyes just to the opportunity to be viewed as an equal, granted by French people in this case. And so when they come back from the war, there's going to be a lot of examples of empowerment we're going to see in the black community. For example, in the Red Summer of 1919, a very unfortunate event where, as the picture up here indicates, you can see there were riots going on in a lot of the major cities of America, especially a lot of the cities where Great Migration had led black communities to develop and grow. And so a lot of times there's going to be pushback and friction with the white community there that viewed this as a threat to jobs or lifestyle or what have you. And so there's going to be a lot of violence, almost all of it caused by the white community attacking the black community. But all across America, we have these riots, hence the Red Summer, because it's going on all across a year and in many different places. What we see different, though, is unlike race riots we learned about in the past, the black community does defend itself in a wide scale. So we're seeing a lot of resistance to this, and there will sadly be deaths on both sides, but that indicates that within the black community, people are defending themselves, as opposed to earlier race riots like Wilmington, where the black community just recognized there was so little hope of defending themselves that the number one option most people chose to do was just to flee. Here we're seeing something different. And so that is one sense, a very unfortunate event, but the resistance we see here obviously indicating just slight changes in the mindset of many members of the black community. Another thing that's going to show that is going to be the growth of the NAACP, the group that was started in 1909 as part of the Niagara movement to pursue equality through the courts and raise up a generation of lawyers that can challenge discrimination and whatnot in Plessy versus Ferguson. Its membership in 1917, right before the war, for us was about 2,700 or 27,000, I believe. Okay, by the end of the war, it was almost 27,000, excuse me. So basically, it goes up by 10 times. And again, when you see something grow within 10 times in less than a 10-year period, that obviously indicates that a lot of people are starting to join the NAACP because they're starting to believe in the message and, more importantly, believe it's actually attainable. So we're starting to see that. But whereas on the one hand, we see this empowerment that leads to, communities defending themselves and people within the community joining groups that are seeking to promote equality, we're also going to see a very different manifestation of that with the rise of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Okay, the UNIA is the United Negro Improvement Association that Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican migrant to the United States, starts in 1916 in Harlem. And it's basically going to be a group that promotes several ideologies. On the one hand, you have Pan-Africanism, which was an ideology Garvey kind of helps craft that believes that it's almost like a black nationalism where basically black people all around the world need to unite under one movement with the ultimate goal to retake Africa, and that Africa would be a continent of the black community, and there would be no presence of Europeans there like there were in that time period as a byproduct of imperialism. Okay, so that was the long-term goal. And the short-term goal, he was preaching empowerment to the black community. And so what he wanted to see in the United States is, and we'll see this, is like in black churches, you'll start to see the worship of a black Jesus figure. He'll create an agency called the Black Cross, which was like a medical organization to treat the black community. He creates the Black Star Cruise Line, which is basically just ships that he was buying most of them, in order to, A, make money, but B, his ultimate goal, he was hoping to use them to then transport members of the black community from all around the world back to Africa. Now, the group is going to fall apart in 1927 as he's accused of mail fraud by the government and goes to jail and then gets deported as he was defrauding a lot of people, allegedly. And a lot of people didn't believe in his message. W.B. Du Bois is quoted as saying about Marcus Garvey that he's the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race that I know of, or that might be a slight paraphrase of the quote, but it's pretty much that. And so basically there's a lot of people that say, no, we don't want what Marcus Garvey's selling. This attitude of Pan-Africanism is not necessarily correct, but the rise of Garvey does show us that there is empowerment going on in the black community. And so you see another picture just of the headquarters in Harlem, and so we'll move on to the next topic. Okay. But while all this change is going on in America, just a lot of change going on in America, we're going to start to see that there is a backlash developing, and it's going to be a backlash that's going to drive conservative movements in America, some of them politically, some of them socially, but we're going to see this all through the 1920s. And in some ways, it was a backlash against the imperialism of the 19-teens and other eras of the progressive era. Some points, it's a conservative political backlash against progressive domestic policies we saw in the previous era. But it's also going to be a social backlash against just changing lifestyles that we're seeing in this period. So we'll go ahead and start unpacking that. All right, starting with political. Now, the first thing we're going to see is the Red Scare. This takes place kind of as a byproduct of World War I, where on the one hand, you have the communist Bolshevik takeover of Russia, which causes a lot of people around the world to freak out that communists are coming to the country, which in this era was largely untrue. There were communists in our country, but such a small number. But the panic that ensued as a result of it is going to have lots and lots of impacts, especially impacts on immigrants, as it's going to trigger a wave of nativism in America. As we see in this little cartoon, it's been used on the AP exam many, many, many times, where it's basically saying there's the American flag. You have Reds listed on the guy's hat. Reds, a term for communists in that time period because the blood that is supposed to be poured out in these revolutions. Okay, you also have Bolshevism written on his knife and anarchy in his torch. And so basically, that's the mindset that's trying to happen. So the person who wrote this cartoon labels it, put them out and keep them out. So obviously, they don't want immigrants here because they view immigrants as a potential communist threat. All right, one example of how this is going to show up in society are the Palmer raids we learned about in World War I, but Department of Justice just goes around and attacks groups that they view as enemies. The most famous examples when they went after Eugene Debs, the International Workers of the World, the Socialist Party, and groups like that. But we're seeing this kind of wide-scale manifestation of this Red Scare paranoia. Another example would be the Sacco Vanzetti trial, where there's a murder in Boston in the early 1920s, and without much real evidence saying so, Sacco and Vanzetti, the two guys you can see in that picture, are going to be put on trial, arrested, and sentenced to death for the armed robbery that occurred in this post office. At the time, there was really no evidence other than we think it was two Italian immigrants. And so it seems like a case that was mostly driven just by paranoia of an unwelcome people group with unwelcome views. Sacco and Vanzetti were well known for being anarchists and atheists and just other things that were not particularly American seeming in this time period. And so even though during the time of this trial, because the trial gets appealed, so it takes several years to play out, another person actually confessed to committing the crime that they are found guilty of, they are still executed in 1927 for that crime anyway. And so long story short, it looks like this trial was another thing caused by the paranoia of the time period. All right, another thing we're going to see that's kind of a byproduct of this Red Scare and nativism that's going on in America is the rise of the quota system. The quota system is going to be the descriptor for immigration policy in this time period, where our government's going to start to set quotas as far as how many immigrants we let into the country. So nativism has been floating around in our country since the 1840s with the Irish immigration that came to our country in that time period, but now it's finally going to spill over into formal government policy, whereas in the past we had important examples of it, like the Chinese Exclusion Act or some of the literacy tests that were used in the 1890s, or the Gentleman's Agreement in 1906. It's never been like a wide-scale systematic type thing that lasted. This, on the other hand, will be that. Okay, and so the quota system is going to start with the Emergency Immigration Reform Act of 1921, sometimes called the Johnson Act. This is a bill that basically said they're going to use the 1910 census, and they're only going to let in immigrants up to 3% of the population of any ethnic group measured by that census in 1910. So if you have 100,000 people with Italian ancestry, from that point forward, they're only going to let 3,000 in per year. So that's basically what the law is trying to say. And it leads to this political cartoon where during this time period, there's tons and tons of people from Europe trying to come to the United States because of how much Europe got destroyed in World War I. And there's just not very good economic opportunity. People are suffering. So a lot of people want to come to America, which actually got relatively wealthy during this time period and is going to be surging into the roaring 20s, where allegedly everything's okay economically. But as you can see, Uncle Sam is putting in a gate. So you already have this funnel, which is because only so many people can come over here just because of the number of boats that exist and other things. But now we have this gate where it's a 3% tariff, so to speak, being put on the migration to the United States. So it's slowing it down a lot. The problem is by 1924, a lot of nativists did not think it was slowed down enough. And so they're going to pass a law called the National Origins Act, which not only tries to limit immigration in general, but it also then tries to target which immigrants we would consider as quote-unquote good immigrants or what immigrants we consider quote-unquote bad immigrants, with the quote-unquote good immigrants falling from the stock of the old immigrants, if you remember that concept from the Gilded Age. And so this is going to change the Emergency Immigration Reform Act to where instead of using the 1910 census with a 3% ratio, we're going to use the 1890 census, the year before the new immigrants started surging to our country, and a 2% ratio. So 2% is obviously a lot less than 3%. And the 1890 census, you're going to have a lot less new immigrants, as the 1890s were the period that new immigration was on the rise. And so what we see is this chart down here. As you can see, there was a lot of immigration in the years leading up to World War I. There's even more, notice that's a 7-year period, there's even more in the first year after the Emergency Immigration Reform Act. But the problem nativists had was that we were seeing a lot from Northwest Europe, which a lot of nativists would have been okay with that because there was a lot of like racial identity and racial view built into the nativist argument frequently. But you see on the Southeast Europe, that new immigrant region, it was still 79,000, which is too high for the nativist sentiment in our country to accept. And so what we see is the National Origins Act 24, then the year following it, notice the immigration from Northwest Europe stays roughly the same. But if you look to Southeast Europe, the new immigrants, that's what was heavily targeted by that. So we go from 79,000 to 13,000. And obviously that's getting rid of less of the quote unquote desirable, or it's getting rid of the quote unquote undesirable immigrants. And so with that, we see how this quota system not only limits immigration, but it's also now targeting certain people groups within our society and abroad. And then another thing we're going to see as part of this conservative backlash was setbacks for labor unions. And that was driven by a lot of things. I mean, one argument historians put forth was that the economy was a little bit better, so there was less need for labor unions. Another argument is during the Red Scare, people viewed unions as just a little too close to communist. And so they didn't want them here, as both are groups that support workers, albeit in very, very different ways. But whatever, there's a lot going on. We see the IWW that we already learned about in the last unit getting destroyed by the Palmer raids, and they cease to exist as a union. We're also going to see the court. There's going to be several court cases like Hammer versus Dagenhart, Adkins versus Children's Hospital, Bailey versus Drexel Furniture. And again, you don't need to know a lot of details about these cases. Just know that these were all cases that sided against labor by getting rid of child labor laws, getting rid of laws that protected women, getting rid of a tax that was trying to get rid of child labor. Okay. And then we're also going to see that the court during the 1920s is going to end over 25% of labor disputes, issue an injunction against the union to break up the strike. And so kind of like what we saw towards the end of the Gilded Age, the courts become a big weapon against unions. And so what we see by the end of the 1920s, even before the Great Depression sets in, membership has declined. In 1920, there were 5 million members of unions. By 1929, there's only 3.5 million. So labor that was kind of gaining rights and gaining standing in the progressive era has some major setbacks, which kind of demonstrates that we're moving into more of a conservative era that's a little less friendly to the interests of labor. But now we're going to talk about how this moves over into the social realm as we move into the political philosophy known as the return to normalcy. And you guys should remember that because that was the philosophy preached by Harding. And it was basically just this idea that we ought to get back to the Gilded Age, or we were isolationist. We were more quote-unquote free market theorists, a little less progressive agenda. And he's also going to use that to gain the support of social conservatives in this era as well as political conservatives. All right, so what's going on with social conservatism in this period is known as the Culture Wars. Now, the Culture Wars is going to be this thing that kind of started before this period, but it gets big during this period, and it's going to only get bigger as we move forward in history. And it's still around today. In many ways, the culture wars are the thing that is probably the most neatest divider of what it means to be conservative or what it means to be liberal in America today. And we start to see this in this time period. Okay. The culture war is basically driven by the fact that America was shifting from a rural population to an urban population, just kind of some of the different views and values and lifestyles that sometimes you see in those two different settings. With, on the one hand, America by 1920 is at a 50% threshold where urbanization, which has been happening for the last 100 years, kind of really starting with the Industrial Revolution back in the early 1800s, is now finally caught up with the rural populations of America. And so we start to see how this becomes a battleground for just cultural views in society. One example is how the Victorian era and its view of women that preached largely the cult of domesticity and the women were going to be moral and pure, wear very conservative dress that covers up all skin and just all the different things you see in Victorian era. Hair would be bunched up on the head, just so that women would be the definition of modesty and purity and be the moral leaders of America. Well, that's giving way to the 1920s flappers. And the flapper becomes the most famous image of the 1920s for women, but at large as well, because the flappers, as you can see in this picture, just totally different lifestyle. where a lot of women, instead of like accentuating curves like they did in the Victorian era, start to cover them up with slightly baggy dresses. They show more skin, as you can see with like the lower legs and the arms. And these pictures, they get different haircuts with a lot of the bob haircuts, as you can see. They put on garish makeup that overemphasize their features, unlike in the Victorian era where they were trying to like hide and make their features more subtle. They danced dances like the Charleston, the Foxtrot, et cetera, just different things that were goofy and fun and all that, as opposed to the Victorian era, women are supposed to be reserved. They drank, they smoked. They were just basically the cultural opposition, the polar opposite to Victorian era mindset and morality. And so this becomes one of the big battlegrounds in the culture wars, with more of the rural communities supporting more of the Victorian era mindset and more of the urban communities supporting the flapper mindset. And so that becomes one of the things driving these culture wars. Another thing was the topic of science versus religion, which really stems back from 1859 when Darwin writes his On the Origin of Species. And what that is, introduces evolution and whatnot. But that then calls into question the accounts of creation in the Christian Bible, or the Bible in general, if that part's from the Old Testament, from Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and 3, because, that has 7 days, man made in God image, whereas, science is now saying, no, it couldn't have taken place 7 days, and man possibly has evolved, et cetera, et cetera. So these debates start to take place. And a lot of churches, especially in urban areas, start to become called accommodationists, where they're saying, well, okay, Christianity is still true, but maybe the creation account is more symbolic or something along those lines. And as that's starting to happen in the urban communities, we start to see out in the rural communities the rise of something called Christian fundamentalism, based on a book that came out in the 19-teens, written by a guy just saying that the fundamentals of Christianity are this. And one of the fundamentals were basically that the Bible is inerrant and it is factually correct and it's not symbolic, but it's a literal telling of the truth. And so you start to see these two debates between the urban and rural churches, kind of like we saw debates in the churches back in the Second Great Awakening between northern churches and southern churches as it pertained to things like slavery and whatnot. Similar kind of things, but instead of north-south, it's more rural-urban. And the most famous example of this is going to be a preacher named Billy Sunday, who used to be a professional baseball player. There's a picture of him down there. And he's going to go around America in the 1920s, make lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of speeches. He's a very charismatic, very powerful speaker. And he preaches very much a conservative view, where it's the literal telling, it's anti-evolution, it's anti-flapper. He tended to be kind of anti-immigrant as well, as communists are being viewed as being anti-religious. Just a lot of different things, but basically anything that you're seeing as the conservative mindset, this traditionalist mindset that you see in the 1920s, Billy Sunday preaches, as well as, the Christian Bible obviously is a Christian speaker, and he's a powerful voice. Over 100 million Americans will actually hear him at some point in their life. So he was a very, very, very influential, powerful speaker. Guys like Adolf Hitler actually studied Billy Sunday, not for his messaging, but just for his powerful ability to give a speech. He was really, really charismatic, really flamboyant. He used all sorts of rhetorical flourish in order to mesmerize a crowd. And there's actually footage out there of Hitler like practicing all his speech giving in a mirror while trying to imitate things Billy Sunday used to do. A lot of fist pumping, a lot of emotional reactions, a lot of anger, just all the type of stuff that made Billy Sunday charismatic. And he's going to be one of these big voices that helps draw a lot of people into the traditional mindset. The most famous example of this debate might have been the most famous moment in the culture wars period in the 1920s. It's going to be the Scopes monkey trial, it's often called, in Dayton, Tennessee, where you have Scopes, the science teacher who teaches evolution, when Tennessee passes a law saying you can't teach evolution. And so he goes to jail. He's going to be represented in this trial by Clarence Darrow, who was an atheist. He was one of the most famous lawyers in our country. And so he volunteers to represent him, hoping that this will make the law look bad that was saying you have to teach creationism. William Jennings Bryan, our populist guy from 1896, who's still floating around out there. He's going to represent the state of Tennessee in this case. You can see Darrow in that picture on the left, William Jennings Bryan on the right. And the trial is going to go on for several days. It's a pretty interesting event. Long story short, Clarence Darrow, by the end of the trial, puts the Bible on the stand, as this was turning into kind of a media circus. It was one of the biggest events from the 20s, with pretty much everybody in America following along. Bryan goes up to represent the Bible, and then Darrow and Bryan get in a bunch of heated exchanges where Darrow's trying to say we can't use the Bible as a source of history from the creation account. Bryan you should. Long story short, the case ends with Scopes being found guilty of teaching evolutions. He's going to pay a fine and all that. And then the people who followed it in the media felt like William Jennings Bryan kind of came off as a closed-minded idiot. And so a lot of people view this as being a major setback for traditionalism, as Bryan really didn't represent the group particularly well. And so this becomes one of those super famous moments of conflict in the culture wars, where it seemed like everybody in America, whether they were from the liberal modernist perspective or the conservative traditionalist perspective, had a dog in the fight. And so this became a big media sensation. Another topic in the culture wars was immigration, which we already talked about, with the more liberal mindset being kind of neutral or at sometimes more pro-immigration, but the more traditionalist conservative mindset wanting things like the quota system. And we saw in the previous slide how they got that. All right, another topic that was really big in the time period of the culture wars was prohibition. Prohibition, which has been on the rise since the 1820s with the temperance movement back in the Second Great Awakening era. And then the Gilded Age is going to grow even further with groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. 1873 it's formed. Frances Willard was its founder, but Carrie Nation, seen here in this picture, was the most famous member. Becomes a celebrity of sorts in the country, wielding her hatchet and her Bible, where she would run into saloons and just start breaking up bottles of liquor and other things like that in order to kind of protest alcohol drinking, and raises a lot of awareness. Another group that's going to rise up in this period is the ASL, the Anti-Saloon League. They're more of a lobbyist type organization that would do a lot of petitioning of governments just to try and get rid of alcohol. And the groups are very effective because by the time we get to the 18th Amendment, 1919, before that amendment, over 75% of Americans already lived in what were known as dry counties, wet being the term for someone that drinks, dry being the term for someone that doesn't. And so basically, alcohol had almost been outlawed by the time this amendment gets ratified, but it gets ratified anyway. We are now in the era of prohibition, and it's going to have limited impacts. Like drinking did go down during this time period, like the amount of consumption, but not to the extent you would want it to if you're promoting prohibition. And the number of places actually increased, which makes sense because the number of places people consume alcohol have to become smaller, more secretive. They're going to start to call these speakeasies. It's going to be a place where organized crime is going to supply the alcohol in a process called bootlegging. That's a picture of Al Capone, the most famous crime boss in this time period, who out of Chicago makes most of his money on the alcohol trade. And he's going to end up going to jail down the road for tax evasion. But the fact that guys like him could take over the city of Chicago, where every lawyer, every cop, every judge in the entire city were on his payroll, that's how much money was at stake in this bootlegging era. There's a picture of a bootlegging car that obviously was supposed to look like a lumber truck, but you can see government agents, finding where the alcohol was stored. Same thing here. You got the government agents enforcing what's called the Volstead Act. That was just the law that was implemented that allowed the government to go around and do all this, dumping out bootleg alcohol they found in a barrel into the sewers. And then there's a picture of a speakeasy where you can see a group of people in a small little bar, obviously drinking and mocking the 18th Amendment. But long story short, prohibition really only lasts for about 10 years with the traditionalists, a little over 10, with the traditionalist conservatives opposing alcohol and the liberal modernists more supportive of it. And so once again, it just becomes a popular battleground for these culture wars. And then race, as we talked about on the last slide, also was one where a lot of the conservatives tended to be opponents of black empowerment in this time period. And more, not all, as we saw, progressives definitely had a blind spot when it came to supporting civil rights, but some from the liberal, more modernist culture war perspective did believe in supporting African American empowerment and whatnot. But the most famous example of this conservative backlash and this developing debate over race and the role of the black community in America is probably going to be seen most famously in the rebirth of the KKK, which in the 1920s is going to, if you remember, in Reconstruction, it was a relatively big group, but then the federal government broke it up with the Force Acts and the KKK Act. So it kind of just existed in very small scale after that. Just here and there, there'd be little incidences of violence that obviously are terrible. But the group wasn't like this big national thing anymore until post-World War I, where the group rebrands, gets a lot bigger, and becomes this huge, huge, huge organization. They move their headquarters from Atlanta, Georgia to Washington, D.C. They start to become this group that they still hate black people, but they also now hate immigrants, they hate alcohol, they hate evolution, they hate flappers. So we're seeing how groups like the KKK start to view themselves as like the foot soldiers in these culture wars for the conservative mindset. Although I hope a lot of conservatives would in this era would have opposed them, but they still viewed themselves as conservatives. And the most famous example of this is soon after moving their national headquarters to Washington, D.C., they announced their grand parade in Washington, where over 30,000 members of the Klan are going to march through our Capitol streets. And you can see in that picture up there how this becomes a big deal. And obviously, they're doing it. That in and of itself is significant. But notice there you don't see almost any records of like people protesting them very much in this time period or opposing them doing this. And so it shows that in society at this point, there's sort of like a wide scale acceptance of these views. And the group will cease to it'll cease to lose, or it'll cease to have some of its influence here in the near future as its leader is found being guilty of basically swindling a lot of people out of their money, as he was treating this more like a pyramid scheme and he was profiting off a bunch of the people who joined the group. But the group doesn't go away, and obviously it's still around today, much smaller than it used to be. But in the 20s, it kind of peaked in its existence, in large part because it was tapping in to this conservative mindset that was so much a part of American history period.